right, welcome back everyone. This is going to be Unit 2, Chapter 24. We're going to start here with Learning Objective 1. And Learning Objective 1 says, explain the various homeostatic mechanisms for regulating the pH of the body, including the roles of buffers, the respiratory system, and the urinary system in regulating the normal pH of the arterial blood, just the blood flowing through your arteries. Okay, let's take a look at our first slide here, where we will talk about acid, balance, base. So we talked a little bit about pH and acids and bases in the last lecture, and it should come as no surprise to you that we do not want our blood and our tissues to deviate too far from the normal pH of around 7.35 to 7.45. Because even slight deviations from normal pH can really cause some serious harm. You go into something called acidosis if your pH of your blood falls below 7.35, right? Because below 7 is generally considered acidic. And you go into something called alkalosis, which is your blood is too basic if it gets over 7.45. And then if you get below 6.8 or above 8.0, those instances of acidosis or alkalosis quickly become fatal. And so obviously it's very important that that doesn't happen. That might be stating the obvious there. So there are a few homeostatic mechanisms that help us to maintain pH. And really it is talking about buffers. Buffers are basically any mechanism that helps resist large changes in pH. Buffers, in that sense, maintain pH homeostasis. And there's a few things we'll talk about today. Chemical buffers, which are bicarbonate, phosphate, and proteins, and they accept or release protons, or hydrogen ions, because remember, the concentration or the molarity of protons determines pH. And then we'll talk about physiological buffers, things like the respiratory and urinary systems, which help us buffer the pH of our blood. They control the body's output of acids, bases, or carbon dioxide. All right, let's start with our first line of defense, the chemical buffers. And the first one here is bicarbonate. And so here is this equation. Let me list things out for you. CO2, you know, is carbon dioxide, water, H2O. This is carbonic acid, H2CO3. This is bicarbonate ion. You can see it's an ion because it has a charge. And this is a hydrogen ion. So if you take a look, this is sort of the main area we're looking right in the middle of this equation. And it can go to the left or to the right and go back and forth. Okay? This is a reversible reaction. It can go either direction in order to maintain pH homeostasis, in order to either increase or decrease the pH of the blood. When it shifts to the right, carbonic acid releases protons, releases H plus into the blood. That will, of course, make it more acidic and lower the pH. Now, if it shifts to the left, H plus is bound by HCO3, bicarbonate, and that results in less protons being available in the blood. And that, of course, makes the blood more basic and increases the pH. Okay, so that's the bicarbonate way of buffering. Here is phosphate's way of buffering. And the phosphate buffer system plays a role in blood plasma and erythrocytes, which are white blood cells. So any acid can react with monhydrogen, okay? Monhydrogen phosphate. That just means one hydrogen in a phosphate group, this right here. Any acid can react with that to form dihydrogen phosphate. In this case, if this proceeds to the right, we get dihydrogen phosphate liberating or releasing protons, which would of course make the blood more acidic, or it can proceed to the left and monhydrogen phosphate can bind this proton to become dihydrogen phosphate, and it can make the blood more basic. Okay? So that's our second example, phosphate buffers. Our third example are protein buffers. And here's an example where your carboxyl group, remember amino acids have an amino group, the central carbon, and a carboxyl group, and then an R group is what makes them different from each other. Well, the carboxyl group can liberate protons, making this more acidic, or the amino group can grab them up and make them more basic. So chemical buffering, protein buffering, accounts for nearly 75% of all chemical buffering. The ability for proteins to buffer is due to whatever their side group is letting them do. Either the side group will let them accept protons or donate protons. And I just said carboxyl groups will release, making it more acidic, lowering the pH, and amino groups will bind protons, increasing the pH and making it more basic. Okay, so that was our first line of defense. Now we'll talk about our second line of defense, and really, this is the strong ways that we have of buffering the pH of our blood. And the first we'll talk about is the respiratory system, obviously breathing. This is 2 to 3 times stronger than chemical buffers, and it utilizes that bicarbonate buffering system, but also control and rate and depth of respirations. So you remember this is the bicarbonate way of going, but we can also increase our rate of respiration, breathing in and out, and we can also take larger and deeper breaths in order for this to happen quicker, and we can make larger changes. The second is the urinary system, where protons get secreted from blood into the renal tubules, which is basically going into the urine, which we will then remove from the body. Most of the protons are then bound by bicarbonate or ammonia or those phosphate buffers we talked about. The bound and the free protons get excreted when you go to the restroom and you excrete urine. And because it actually expels protons from the body, the urinary system is our best tool for buffering in our body. Because everything else that we've talked about, they've sort of incorporated those protons into other molecules. This system actually just gets rid of them altogether, right? They go out of you and into the toilet. So it's really, really a good way of buffering pH. Renal tubules can also reabsorb carbon dioxide, which is then converted into bicarbonate, which is then another way in which we can continue on the bicarbonate process of buffering. Okay, excuse me, that was a knock on the door there. But so I think we left off saying that this is just a really good way of which the body can buffer pH. Okay, we're almost done here. We only have 2 more slides. This is just an overview of buffering in the body. And if you were to look at this in your textbook, you would see the bottom portion of this too. But we'll look at what happens when the blood pH increases first. So we get a sense that the blood pH is increasing, and that means that the concentrations of protons have decreased, right? Because we are increasing the pH. We're getting more basic. So this is something that sometimes gets confusing. When you're increasing pH, you're decreasing proton concentration. So you're getting more basic. What happens? Well, buffers will then release protons. Then the number of protons in the blood increases. A decrease in the blood pH, more acidic results, and blood maintains or goes back to homeostasis. The respiratory system, the decreased numbers of protons get detected by the medullary respiratory center. The respiratory center then decreases your rate and depth of respiration, resulting in decreased gas exchange between the blood and the air. And the increased blood carbon dioxide reacts with water to produce carbonic acid, which dissociates to increase protons and, of course, then lower the pH. And then what happens in your kidneys is it gets detected by the distal tubules in the kidneys. The distal tubules decrease proton secretion into the urine, right? Because you don't want to expel any protons anymore into your urine. And that increases urine pH and decreases bicarbonate reabsorption into the blood. Fewer protons get removed from the blood because there's less bicarbonate, and that also will end up decreasing the blood's pH. Now, let's go to the opposite side of this. This is our last slide here. Let's say the blood pH decreases. When pH decreases, that means there's an increase in ion concentration. So, what happens then? We're now too acidic, so buffers have to bind protons. Or the respiratory system, the increased number of protons gets detected by the medullary respiratory center. It increases your rate and depth of respiration, that means we need to increase gas exchange. And as blood carbon dioxide decreases because we are breathing a lot more, right? We're getting that carbon dioxide out of our bodies. Protons and bicarbonate will combine to form carbonic acid, which becomes CO2 and water. And that will eventually increase the concentration of protons, decreasing your pH. Decrease the concentration, which will increase your pH. And in the kidneys, they'll detect that increased number of protons in the distal tubules, and that will increase secretion of urine, which decreases the urine pH, makes it more acidic because you're putting more protons into there. More of the protons are removed from blood, and that increased number of bicarbonate in the blood removes protons from the blood by combining with it to form carbonic acid. And of course, you're producing more urine, so you'll go to the restroom. Okay, so that is it for chapter 24, and quicker video there, and I'll see you in the next unit.